The initial signals from the reports was a ransom note. By the time you see that, it's a little bit too late. The threat actor's in your house. The attack surface area can be so massive. You can be overwhelmed with all the intelligence. So the challenge really becomes, what's critical to you and where do you focus?
Welcome to the CISO Signal True Cybercrime Podcast. I'm Jeremy Ladner. In late 2020, cybercriminal groups discovered a weakness in a system used by hospitals, universities, financial institutions, and government agencies around the world. Not a new platform, an old one. Accellion FTA, a file transfer appliance designed years earlier to solve a very specific problem: how to move large sensitive files between organizations without exposing the rest of the network. In its day, it was cutting edge, a secure corridor connecting institutions, a dark box in a network closet that did one job quietly and did it well. For nearly 20 years, organizations like Kroger, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and the University of California trusted that corridor with their most valuable data. And then, attackers found it. What followed was not a single breach, but a coordinated campaign, one focused on data theft and another on pressure, and in some instances, 7-figure ransom demands. While defenders tried to understand what was happening, deadlines were already being set, data was already gone, and questions were already being asked. Not just by attackers, but by regulators, by boards, by lawyers. Questions like, why was the system still running? Who owned it? And how many other organizations were exposed in the same way? This is the story of the Accellion breach. And to help us answer those questions, we're welcoming back to the podcast Christopher Russell. Chris is the CISO at tZERO Group, bringing deep experience in threat intelligence, legacy system risk, and incident response. And joining Chris and I is Benjamin Lipczynski, Director of Cybersecurity and Regulatory Services at this episode's sponsor, Origina. Origina helps enterprises safely operate, govern, and extend mission-critical systems that may have outlived their original vendor support models. Ben brings more than 20 years of experience across defense, critical infrastructure, and rapid incident response, helping organizations reduce risk, preserve stability, and regain control without being forced into rushed, expensive, or unnecessary upgrades. Ben, Chris, it's great to have you both on the show. How are you gentlemen doing this evening?
Really good, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Very well, thank you for having me.
Excellent. Let's begin the investigation. We are in the midst of a ceaseless war. Not of bombs or bullets, but of breaches, firewalls, and silent incursions. The targets? Our borders, our banks, our commerce, and the critical infrastructure that underpins a free civilization. The enemy is cloaked in code, fueled by greed, glory, and a desire for chaos. This is the story of the unseen protectors, the nameless generals, the CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers. They are the guardians at the gate, the watchers on the wall, ever vigilant and always listening for the CISO signal. For deeper breach timelines and regulatory analysis that you can't find anywhere else, visit thecisosignal.com or subscribe to our LinkedIn newsletter. Act 1. The Corridor. Accellion FTA was built to be a corridor, a controlled passage for sensitive files to move between organizations without needing to open every door in the building. Contracts, records, regulated data, the kinds of files that do not get a second chance if they end up in the wrong hands. This corridor was designed to be predictable, invisible, uneventful in the way critical infrastructure is supposed to be uneventful. Order closes come, regulatory reporting happens, patient intakes need to be done, moments when the business cannot afford surprises. And because it never caused problems in the past, it stayed open. Not because it was perfect, but because it was relied upon. Ben, before the breach even begins, help us set the stage. When you look at a decades-old system like Accellion, still patched, still quietly running critical workflows, what does that tell you about the organizations that depend on systems like that for so long?
Yeah, well, we've seen this, good few times where there's that small piece of technology that's been there for years that people kind of forget about and kind of forget what it actually serves and delivers. And certainly when you talk about file transfer technologies, these were implemented when you couldn't email these large files easily enough. But more recently, we've seen customers be able to overcome these challenges of emailing large media files, for example, just over email. So these older technologies become neglected and forgotten about.
This is how it happens. Not in dramatic failure, but in quiet success measured by nothing going wrong. A system that never makes noise is a system no one wants to question until they have no choice.
Equally, the business processes don't exist there to revalidate some of these technologies because the silos are the natures of these customers. So they sit there unnoticed, not causing any alerts, possibly unmonitored, until something like this happens.
By 2020, platforms like Accellion were still moving sensitive material between enterprises, universities, and public institutions, sometimes because they were trusted, and sometimes because they were simply still there, still integrated, still necessary, still difficult to remove without breaking something else. And while the world changed around it, the corridor stayed.
What I've come to find is there's a lot of organizations that took a pretty decent, set of software, hardware, and did some sort of customizations that really were geared towards their business. It integrated and was the backbone and the feeding system for a lot of other newer systems. And there really wasn't a lot of options to, like the newer version of it would just need the old customization, and replacing it with new technology would also need the customization. So companies really start relying on this really solid, working piece of software that doesn't have a ton of support, and it's doing a very small thing, but it's integral to all these other services.
To the people who relied on it, the system felt dependable, predictable, a small thing that just worked. But to criminals, it looked like leverage. Because the perfect target is not always the newest technology. It's the one the business cannot stop using, the one stitched into the workflow, the one nobody wants to replace in the middle of a quarter, or a merger, or a crisis. Every organization has that corridor that no one wants to look down anymore. The criminals love those corridors. Chris, part of what made the Accellion breach so difficult wasn't just the vulnerabilities, it was the choreography, one group breaking in and taking data at scale, another applying pressure and turning that theft into a countdown clock. From a defender's perspective, what changes when you realize you're fighting two different problems at the same time?
Well, I think in that scenario, you're really facing a battle on two fronts. So you almost have to have at least the capability to have two teams doing parallel moves to deal with the two different situations.
The group tied to this campaign had a name, Clop. Their model was simple: break in quietly, take the files, and then threaten to publish them unless payment arrives. No encryption, no recovery keys, just pressure and a deadline.
There's a different strategy to dealing with fallout with regulators and public opinion than there is with extortion attempts and communicating whatever ransoms and dealing with law enforcement. And what you can't do is sacrifice one for the other.
That's the trap. While one side takes your data, the other takes your time, your attention, your executive bandwidth. The attacker's not only inside your environment, the attacker's inside your calendar, forcing decisions faster than certainty can arrive.
Now, not every organization has two incident response teams that can work at the same time. But I think this is a scenario where if an organization was hit by Clop and Fin11 and they were doing two very different things, they should look at getting basically two teams on retainer. Because while you're dealing with one and the other one gets angry, the ramifications of making some ransomware game upset because they don't feel like they're taking your threat reasonably could mean your data just being exposed or them selling it or them acting hasty. Time is of the essence when these things go off, and if you're not equipped to handle two fronts, you need to really quickly get someone on retainer, bring them in to get up to speed, and at least handle the initial triage of the conversation, even if the same executives are making the decisions on the back end.
What defenders were facing was not a single adversary improvising in real time. It was a campaign built in layers, access and extraction on one track, pressure and exposure on the other. Two movements of the same symphony, timed so that while defenders were still trying to understand what they were seeing, the next phase was already arriving. Act 2. Two fronts. And then came the demands. In cases tied to this campaign, ransom demands were reported in the millions, in some cases far beyond. The University of Colorado disclosed a demand of $17 million and refused to pay. Other victims reported demands reaching into 8 figures. The offer was always the same: pay, and the data stays private. Refuse, and it appears on a leak site, file by file, for anyone to download. There were no guarantees, no proof of deletion, just the hope that the clock would stop. Ben, when an incident like this becomes real, what's the first question that goes through your mind? Not technically, but strategically, the moment when you realize this isn't just an investigation anymore.
Usually starts with, what did I miss? How did we get that file? That's usually the first thing that passes through my head. But then it quickly goes to, so what? And I always ask that question, so what? What does this mean? Does this mean have we stopped operations? Have we lost sensitive data, either our own intellectual property?
That question sounds technical, but it really is a question about ownership, about decisions made years earlier by people who may not even be in the building anymore. In that instant, the incident splits in two: recovery or exposure, and neither one waits patiently.
Are we no longer able to access it if it's just a pure ransomware? Is this a double extortion attack? Am I going to see my data, sensitive data, or even personally identifiable information out there on the web, which could expose us to not only just financial losses through our operations, but we, certainly in Europe under things like GDPR, we could be exposed to considerable fines.
By the time an organization understands what kind of incident this is, the technical questions begin to lose their urgency. Another set of questions enters the room. They're quieter, heavier, more expensive. Who knows who will be told, and who will be forced to explain why this system is still running at all? This is the moment fear arrives, not as a feeling, but as a force.
Fear is a terrible basis for any upgrade strategy here, and we often see a lot of pressure piled on by the OEMs to make that decision, and it can come at considerable cost.
Fear was not a side effect of this attack. It was part of the leverage. Fear of regulatory judgment, fear of public exposure, fear of being asked in a room full of executives why this system was still running at all. Ben, a lot of organizations hear the word non-compliance and immediately feel boxed in. From your experience, what are regulators actually looking for in moments like this, once the breach has already happened?
So I have yet to come across a regulation that says you must apply the latest patch fix. Regulations are there to ensure these critical industries, such as financial services or power or medical, are taking proactive, correct, evidential decisions to secure those environments and the data within.
In the aftermath, another assumption began to crack. Many regulators were not looking for proof that organizations had upgraded fast enough. They were looking for evidence that someone understood what they were operating, that risk had been examined deliberately, and that ownership existed before the crisis, not invented during it.
The other thing I hear is you're non-compliant. Usually just hearing that words is enough fear. The customer sometimes doesn't even challenge. Non-compliant to what? Where am I non-compliant? So all this pressure comes down to the customer to act now.
Accellion exposed a quiet truth. Compliance is not measured by version numbers alone. It's measured by intent, documentation, and whether control exists before pressure arrives. And now, for this episode's quick question, which category of risk worries you most right now? Legacy systems, third-party exposure, agentic attacks, or identity and access? Share your view in the comments. Act 3. Ownership and Fear. Clop understood something about modern institutions. If you want payment, you don't just threaten the company, you threaten the company in public. Victims' names listed, sample files released, proof before pressure escalated. This wasn't about theft. It was about control. By this point, technology alone could not explain what happened next. Organizations facing similar exposure began to diverge, not because of tools, but because of culture. Chris, when you look at organizations that were exposed in similar ways, some managed the fallout far better than others. What do you think it is that usually separates them at that point if it's not the technology itself?
It comes down to an organization's desire to just keep knowledgeable people for their systems versus we're just going to let this run to the ground, and once it stops running, then we'll just divest and move on.
Legacy risk is rarely an accident. It's a slow decision, made again and again and again, until it becomes the default.
But organizations that are concerned with things like business continuity and reputation and, want to have a good customer experience, if they have a system, they want it manned with experts. They want someone that knows how to use it and fix it and deal with it. And as soon as they don't have that, their skin crawls a little bit and they decide, well, I either need to find someone who knows how this works and can fix this if there's a problem, or I need to move on from it.
In moments like this, the difference between two organizations is not whether a system is old, it's whether anyone truly owns that system when it starts to fail.
I think it's just a mentality on the business side of how they want to deal with that problem. They want to proactively spend the money to keep the expertise, to keep people trained on it, to bring in new people, or do they want to just let it run until it's dead?
This was the end of patience. The moment when investigation stopped being the priority because the damage was no longer hypothetical. Act 4. Damage control. There's a moment in every incident when curiosity becomes a liability, when understanding how it happened matters less than accepting what has already happened. This is the moment the hunt stops and damage control begins. Chris, there's a point in an incident where understanding what happened stops being the priority. From your experience, how do you know when it's time to stop investigating and start focusing purely on recovery and response?
Well, you're jumping from investigation and searching in logs and trying to determine what's going on and how bad it is to knowing how bad it is and really shifting into damage control and recovery. So you basically take your incident response script and you skip almost the first third of it and you jump right into talking with the legal team and PR. There's going to be releases. You've determined this is something that's going to be reportable depending on what industry you're in. You can go back and figure out with forensics what happened later, but there's really no value in the moment to do as much of that as much as to focus on the recovery and the response.
At this stage, the breach is no longer contained inside logs and timelines. It's crossed into disclosures, notifications, and public consequence. The question is no longer how deep the intrusion went. It is how much of the organization can survive intact.
But we must also think about resilience when we tie sort of that instant response and defense together, which is quite often misunderstood, but sometimes risks are realized. You do succumb to malicious actions or failing technologies. So it's really about, how do you respond? Can I continue my operations, even though they might be limited? I might only be, 30% production rate, and that's far better than going to your customers and saying, I've had to shut shop now. And then ultimately, okay, I've fallen victim to this, like the Accellion incident. How quickly can I recover or restart my full operations?
Recovery is rarely graceful. It's measured in percentages: 30% capacity, limited operations, partial service. But in the middle of a crisis, survival at 30% can be the difference between rebuilding and disappearing. Chris, if a CISO calls you in a panic and says, we've just been hit, a legacy system we depended on for years has been breached, what would you tell them to focus on first?
I would talk to them about what their response plan is, what their recovery plan is, and say, you know what, we can talk about all the misses that led up to this later, but let's focus on recovery right now and everything we can do to get the company back on track, to get systems online, to get things migrated, because that's the only thing that's a priority in that moment. Figuring out who we want to point fingers at later and where shortcomings just in the moment is just not going to be helpful. And a lot of people are going to push for that. Tell everyone that's for later. Now we just got to fix the problem, and we need all hands on deck for that.
Accellion did not just expose a vulnerability. It exposed how many organizations were running critical systems without clear ownership, without independent perspective, and without a clear plan for what happens when the world around them changes. Ben, for teams quietly running critical parts of the business on older systems, what's the most important lesson from Accellion, especially when it comes to having options, getting independent advice, and staying in control of your modernization timeline? What would you suggest?
Certainly from a security perspective, as we've said, you can't defend what you don't know. And that's not just knowing what version it is and which servers it's deployed on, but what is it connected to? Who uses it? What does it deliver to the business? What would happen if one of these scenarios occurred, that the data was removed from your control or exfiltrated into the public domain? I would also encourage them, if you will, to read the small print of their current support provider, even if that's the OEM, because what we find is that the vulnerabilities or the risk, if you will, is not introduced because of the core product, but it's all those small bits around it. Either the implementation, the configuration, which is often out of support scope, or it's those little open source components that are shipped with that core product, often there to provide interoperability, that are not supported, ironically, by the OEM. But ultimately, you can't defend what you don't know.
Ben, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Hope you come back again soon.
Thank you, Jeremy.
My pleasure. And Chris, of course, thanks for coming back, doing a second show with us, and looking forward to having you back for a third time.
You know I love answering and asking questions.
And now, our closing. The Accellion breach did not arrive as a thunderclap. It arrived as a quiet consequence, a corridor built for a simpler era, still standing long after the map had changed, still trusted, still carrying the files that mattered most. And then, a criminal crew found the weak point and did what criminals always do. They took what they could carry, and then they threatened to display it. For some victims, the pressure arrived as a demand that would reshape budgets, careers, and boardrooms overnight. For others, the damage arrived as disclosure in uncertainty, the kind that lingers long after the incident ticket is closed. What remains after a breach like this is not just a fear of a zero day. It is suspicion of the quiet systems, the ones that sit in the dark and never complain. Because technical debt is not only code, it is governance deferred, ownership unclear, decisions postponed because tomorrow feels easier than today. Systems will continue to outlive their assumptions. Adversaries will keep studying where trust concentrates and attention slips. The difference is whether we close the corridor on our own terms or wait until someone else decides what it's worth to us. And so we remain forever vigilant and always listening for the CISO signal. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't, thanks for listening this long. We'll see you on the next episode of the CISO signal. All episodes are based on publicly available reports, postmortems, and expert analysis. While we've done our best to ensure accuracy, some cybersecurity incidents evolve over time and not all details have been confirmed. Our goal is to inform and entertain, not to assign blame. Where facts are unclear, we've used cautionary language. and we always welcome your corrections. Thanks for listening to the CISO Signal.